Muy buenas tardes. Welcome to the YouTube channel of the Cervantes Institute in Leeds and Manchester. And we are very pleased to welcome you to our fourth edition of this series, Ex Libris Publications in Hispanic Studies, a series under the coordination of Professor Rosi Song from Durham University. Thank you, Rosi, for your wonderful work and cooperation. And this series has a name very clear, is to discuss and to launch the books about the Hispanic studies in the last 2 years in the Anglo-Saxon academia. But before I say something about the book that we are launching tonight, first of all, I would like to thank our special guests, Eugenia Afinoguénova and Rebecca Ingram, for being with us tonight, and of course our deepest gratitude to Rosi's son for her coordination of this series. And as I said, that is already on the fourth edition with a great success. Tonight we have the honor to launch the book Digestible Governance, Gastrocracy and Spanish Foodways, edited by Eugenia Afinoguénova, Lara Anderson, and Rebecca Ingram. Spanish gastronomy has enjoyed remarkable growth over the past few decades, establishing itself as a global culinary leader by fostering regional development across the country. Driven by innovation and a deep respect for local traditions, Spanish chefs have elevated the traditional recipes and dishes, turning them into the expression of regional identity that highlight the unique flavors and ingredients of each coin of Spain. This culinary renaissance has not only drawn international acclaim, but also has stimulated local economies, encouraging investment in rural areas especially. As a result, gastronomy has gained increasing importance very clearly in cultural studies among scholars and academics, who explore how food reflects and shapes regional identities, social practice, and, as we will see tonight in this book, also the political impact of food and all the process related to it. The book that we launch tonight works with the concept of gastrocracy, which explores how food-related practices, including sourcing, preparation, distribution, and consumption, serve political purposes. In Spain, this relationship between gastronomy and governance dates back to the 19th century, but has gained particularly prominence in recent years. Nationalism debates increasingly take the shape of discussions around regional and local cuisines, influenced by movements like the slow food and for example, the 2011 UNESCO recognition of the gastronomic meal of the French as an intangible cultural heritage. Since then, numerous public and private initiatives across Spain, such as the launch of the Gastromarca in 2016, have sought similar recognition for Spanish and its regional cuisines. This initiative reflects the broader economic and cultural impact of food as well as its political relevance. And now I will give a very brief academic biography of our special guests. First, Eugenia Afinoguénova is professor in Spanish Literature and Cultural Studies at Marquette University in the Department of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures. She earned a BA and MA in Spanish and Literature from Moscow State University and a PhD in Spanish Peninsular Literature and Cultural Studies from Georgetown University. Since joining Marquette in 1999, she has taught a range of courses in contemporary Spanish literature, film, and cultural studies. Professor Afinoguénova has served on the editorial boards of notable journals, including the Bulletin of Association of Spanish and Portuguese Historical Studies and Anales Galdosianos. Recognized with awards such as the 2023 Lawrence G. Haggerty Faculty Award for Excellence in Research, and the 2019 College of Arts and Science Scholar of the Year. She is widely respected, of course, in her field. We had also the great privilege to present in this series as well her book, The Prado Spanish Culture and Leisure, 1819-1939. And now I will introduce also very briefly Rebecca Ingram, who is professor of Spanish language, culture and literature at the University of San Diego, and she's an expert in food studies and feminist theory. She's also affiliated faculty in women's and gender studies. She holds a PhD and a master in Romance studies from Duke University, with graduate certificates in women's studies and European studies, and a bachelor from Emory University, where she graduated summa cum laude. Her scholarship has been published in journals such as EVM, Cuadernos de Estudios Manuel Vázquez Montalbán, RAE-IC, Revista de la Asociación Española de Investigación de la Comunicación, and also the Bulletin of Hispanic Studies, among others. She is author of Women's Work, How Culinary Studies Shape Modern Spain, which was also presented in this series as Libris. And her recent work includes the book that we are launching tonight, Digestible Governance, co-edited with Eugenia Afinoguénova and Lara Anderson. And very recently, only 2 weeks ago, it was published, her last work, the book that she has co-edited with Janet Acosta, Food Studies in Español. Ingram's ongoing projects focus on themes like not only food, but also race, women, labor, and contemporary history, enriching her reputation and influential voice in food studies and cultural research. Thank you very much for your presence. Thank you to our audience. You all know that you have the possibility to put your questions in our chat, and Rosi will put our guests at the end of their discussion. And you can also put the questions if you prefer in Spanish or in English. And without further ado, I give the floor to Professor Rosi. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you so much, Pedro. Thank you, Instituto Cervantes, for allowing us to host again a conversation about this new book. It is really exciting to welcome back Eugenia and Rebecca. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, morning, where you are, to talk about your recent edited volume with Lara Anderson, who unfortunately, due to time zone difference, she's in New Zealand, we haven't been able to include her today. We have actually hosted each one of you in the series before with your individual books on El Museo del Prado and on women's work and food culture in Spain. And it's really a great pleasure and honor to welcome you back with a collective project on food studies in Spain. So I would like to start our conversation about the volume with some discussion about some of the terms actually that introduces and discusses. Can you explain to our listeners and hopefully future readers, all of you, each one of you, what is gastrocracy? I think it's a difficult term for all of us to pronounce, gastrocracy. And what do you understand or mean by actually another term that quickly comes out in your introduction, which is biopolitics? And what does biopolitics have to do with food studies?
Yeah, thanks for this question, Rosi. I think I'll jump in because I think I was the one who has been speaking about gastrocracy as a tongue twister for a while. But before I proceed, I would like to thank you for hosting us here and giving us an opportunity, the first opportunity to present this book that has been published recently in the Ex Libris series. Also, thank you to Pedro Jesus Eusebio Cuesta, the director of Instituto Cervantes Manchester Leeds, for hosting us, as you said, por partida doble. And I'm thrilled to be here. Also want to acknowledge some of the contributors of the book that either are here in this audience or will be joining us, at least briefly, and I hope at some point we can all participate in this conversation. I will just also thank you to Carlos for making this virtual meeting a real one. So, gastrocracy. As the word suggests, it is governance through food. But more specifically, so it's like aristocracy, right? But it is about food and not a certain class. More specifically, the volume has 11 chapters that explore the concept of governance that engages and also is engaged by, as you mentioned, Rosi, the acts and discourses that involve sourcing, preparation, distribution, consumption, and representation of food. At the same time, eating is, of course, a daily life. So as part of the daily life practices, and so following Henri Lefebvre, we could suppose that food should be also a potential for resistance. Whether or not this potential is realized when food is called on into governance is a question that we leave open for the moment. The volume was an invitation to discuss that. We reached out to colleagues in different fields from different countries, asking them to explore these intersections of food, governing, and potentially the biting back. We are the fans of the word, but we did not invent it. So the tongue twister is coined by the Spanish philosopher Fernando Savater, who in 2014, in a column in El País, was meditating about the popularity of the MasterChef Junior and other culinary shows on Spanish television. And this is when he compared the popularity of these food shows to soccer, and is exclaimed on the pages of El País, somos una gastrocracia. We are a gastrocracy. So we did not invent the term. However, I think it is productive. It is also fun to think about people that we could call gastrocrats, or institutions or types of food or practices that we could call gastrocratic. I don't know. Yeah, I think I will just leave it here. If Rebecca, you're here, and please jump in at any moment, interrupting me or just continuing whatever I have to say.
Great, thank you. Eugenia, I'm actually going to direct our next question to you, Rebecca. So if you want to pick up part of that answer with and actually link it to my question, that would be great. Because I'd like to continue with some discussion of the terms that come in this book. So we have gastrocracy, we have biopolitics, but one of the terms that actually also is discussed in this book is foodscapes. And Rebecca, you have written in other places about foodscapes. And I think very quickly foodscapes come against foodways. So I was wondering if you could explain a little bit this concept of foodscapes. And how would you differentiate it between foodways and foodscapes? And also all of that as part of the gastrocracy and biopolitics. It's just a very tiny question for you, Rebecca. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosi, and thanks to everybody. Yes, Eugenia's definition of gastrocracia is absolutely on point. And I just want to encourage you all, like, even if you just look at the extended quotation that we have from Savater in the introduction, it is fascinating and exciting and fun to read that, you know, just the way he writes about this concept and what we've developed in fleshing it out theoretically further. We hope to add this term gastrocracy, to this ever-growing list of specific terms and ideas that are coming to influence how we understand food in a very critical way. So the definition of foodway that I think is most kind of known refers to the eating habits and culinary practices of a community, in addition to a group's beliefs and behaviors about food production, distribution, and consumption. That's definition, classic one that comes from Carol Cunahan. Foodscape, on the other hand, comes from Arjuna Padurai's work in 1996. That there exist 5 scapes that animate the global flows and productions of culture. Folklorist Lucy Long has also talked about foodscapes, and she talks about not just global flows of culture, but also local flows, and how these flows and formations of culture have the capacity to create new identities. And then anybody who I talked to in the last year, several of people who were at our ALSA seminar this summer, you know that I love this article by sociologists Jose Johnston and Michael Goodman. It's a 2015 article in the journal Food, Culture, and Society. And for them, this concept of foodscape captures the spaces and the practices of food and the material realities that food culture creates. There are dialectical relationalities, and I'm quoting them, between food culture, its values, meanings, and representation, and the materiality. But I think what's most kind of engaging, at least for my work right now, about this concept of foodscape is how it is racialized, it is classed, it is gendered, right? And so we understand foodscapes as spatial, connecting with the material, but also something that demonstrates these power inequalities that we see when we analyze the talk of food, right? And so gastrocracy, going back to the term that, Eugenia has brought to scholarship already and that we've developed further in this volume, is part of Foodways, and it's also an element of a foodscape. It is political power. This is what we're proposing, that can be marshaled or deployed via food. And I think it adds to this kind of rich theoretical terrain that we're just beginning to explore in relationship to cultures of the Iberian Peninsula and food. Yeah, and so I can answer further questions about that, but I think, you'll notice in me talking about this concept of foodscape and its relation to gender and social class and race, that it resonates with a lot of the chapters that we, had the privilege to, really nurture in this edited volume.
Thank you, Rebecca. That actually question of all these elements that come together in the term foodscapes, I think, again, in your chapters of this volume, once and again, it becomes very clear that what all these interventions bring together is a close connection between food and politics. And in a way, most of the chapters elucidate and explain how food can be understood as a top-down management system, almost. And even when we engage in quotidian eating activities, right, they can be the result of very specific policies or ideologies. And Eugenia, I know that you don't quite deal with this issue. You don't have an essay in this volume, but I know that you in the past have written about sort of this element through the conspicuous Spanish menú del día. So I was wondering if you could perhaps explain this practice as a way to quickly illustrate the point between food and politics, perhaps, and perhaps point to the other examples in the Gastrocracy volume for our listeners today.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for asking this, Rosi. Menú del día, nobody on this call has been spared of it, I'm sure. So I will not explain what it is. I will just remind us that it was launched as a Spanish equivalent of formule in France or business lunch in the Anglo-Saxon world. It was launched in 1964 by the Ministry of Information and Tourism as a tool of price control to support Franco's government's program to foster extensive yet cheap tourism development at a time when there was agricultural crisis that was becoming a political problem in a situation when feeding more and more tourists has become more and more difficult and actually explosive almost. This is a good illustration of what gastrocracy is because it has been accepted by the society, and it has been accepted, in fact, more by the Spanish society than by tourists. I am working, just a very brief mention, in the Spanish version of this publication that I hope will appear at some point. I will include my own chapter about the touristification of pig slaughtering in public and the uses of ritualized sausage making for the development of local identities in different parts of Spain. And these are new type of local identities that are amiable to masculine socialization and also xenophobia. So that's my recent take on the same issue. And I mentioned this because multiple articles already included in this volume lead me here. They show how we find power hasta en la sopa, so to speak. For example, I'll just refer to a few chapters, and I will mention other chapters in the future, hopefully. So some examples. Luis Benito Garcia Alvarez chapter about cider shows how the need for politically institutionalized celebration dignifies the drink and drunkenness related rituals that were previously considered backward and deplorable. Or, for example, Suzanne Brunei chapter tells us about Francoism that tried and failed to make food consumption a public activity rather than a private one, something that now is happening with more success. And honestly, every chapter reveals how power has been and still is baked into our daily bread. We all love food metaphors, right? Or like sliced into our bocadillos, whatever. So Alex Gomez del Moral, for example, writes about the weight of sausage making in Catalan identity. Aitana Guia covers food nativism and its connection to Islamophobia and xenophobia in current Spain and Europe. Javier Medina discusses how food heritage is arbitrarily constructed, also in regards of tourism and other political needs. Montserrat Miller explains that food provisioning has been since the Middle Ages the source of municipal power. And you, in your own chapter, Rosi, uncover the connections between the creation of culinary identity and the political ideas of Ferran Agulló, who was, of course, active in Liga Catalana and is also credited with the coinage Costa Brava. So these are just some of the few examples about how power is everywhere at the time of eating and even thinking about food.
Thank you, Eugenia. Thank you for the shootout as well. Yes, I do have a small chapter there, but I think that the chapters that you mentioned from your other contributors, they're really such a rich source of information and insight that I really encourage our listeners to check out, to learn from them. It has been an incredible experience to read them. Actually, the volume also has an afterword by another scholar who has written previously about food, Caroline Nadeau, who actually identifies two distinct approaches in the volume. So your contributors engage in a way, you could say that they engage in food history and also examine food heritage. These are two terms that you already mentioned, Eugenia. But I think there is this distinction between history and heritage. And I was wondering if you can think about a way to differentiate them or to explain them. What is history and what is heritage for you? or the way we talk about them, sort of from the perspective of food studies. Perhaps we can think about in terms of what do they share, or what we should learn from each other and both, right? I don't think we can actually extricate from each other. They're sort of together, but also they have sort of distinct differences, right? So what would you highlight in the usage of these both terms?
I am happy to talk a little bit about both of these questions, but I'm going to defer to Eugenia for the history part of that, since she is the historian expert, co-editor. But I like the way Carolyn identifies history as identifying these patterns and challenges. And she's talking about Suzanne Dunet's article, that Suzanne shows us very clearly how ideology is converted into policy and then practice, right? That Suzanne traces this in her chapter for the book. But heritage is a different concept altogether. It comes from the past, but heritage is always part of the present. Heritage, to quote Justin Crumbaugh, involves pastness, right? And feelings rather than these documents and texts that form the basis for historical accounts. Heritage processes and projects also involve a sort of activism, often politically sanctioned activism. It can engage communities of people to designate what merits being protected and preserved and what merits being written and celebrated. This is incredibly powerful for communities. Like we've seen, like how these UNESCO kind of designations of intangible cultural heritage have kind of dominated our understanding of food in a global sense for the past 2 decades. You know, that designation gives us a focus for unity and commonality and ways that we can practice togetherness through food and eating. These are effective bonds that are very powerful, but they can also be very divisive. Whose practices are worth preserving? Whose knowledges are representative of a community? Who gets designated as an insider to that community and who's left out, right? Aitana's chapter, Food Fights, Nativism and Culinary Xenophobia, shows precisely what happens when 2 distinct communities with important cultural practices come into competition, right? Does Valencia designate a Chinatown to celebrate the contributions of racialized Valencians to the city and broader community? In the end, no, because where that Chinatown would be designated is an important staging ground for the Fallas festivities, right? And so who's more important? These Chinese Spaniards are not insider enough to have the political pull to have a Chinatown designated. Their practices are not significant enough to merit protections and ceremonies by the city of Valencia. That's just one example that comes from the scholarship. And Eugenia, I'll pass it to you if you want to talk a little bit more about the historical focus here.
Okay, just very briefly, because in fact, my approach to history is coming from heritage. So there is some presentism there, obviously, because in the history, when food is concerned, we look for ways of understanding the phenomena that exist until nowadays, and then that we want to understand better now. Hence, it's very important, for example, you know, citing the classical work by Damaso Alonso about literatura jamonophila and jamonophoba, about like the origins of the popularity of jamon and public consumption of the bones of jamon in Castile, in the lands of, you know, newly and Christianized or reconquered, to use the word, populations, where the fact of being Cristiano Viejo, the old Christian without any Jewish or Muslim roots, was a mark of a social status. So this historical data connects the history of Spain to a history of food, and then allows us to know something about the powerful jamon lobby that is active in Spain nowadays, etc. So the history is the material of diligent tracing through the sources to understand what in reality we are dealing with. I'll be brief there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Eugenia. And I think that is interesting to think about this presentism, right? And as long as these food items have not been lost and they're still part of our daily practices, you have to see them through your lens, right, of your everyday experience and relationship with it. So I think that my question is a bit tricky because you can't really separate from each other. But I think at some point, there is very specific ways in which your contributors rely on history or sometimes rely on heritage. And depending on that stress, right, I think that very more nuanced, perhaps, insights come across. And I really enjoyed sort of that work. And sort of continuing this conversation, we all are very familiar with this phrase when we talk about food and we talk about practices is you are what you eat, right? Or tell me what you eat and I'll tell you who you are, sort of that version of it. And I think that many of the chapters in the volume also engage with the question of difference, right? And difference in this case can be religious, can be racial, can be ethnic, can be regional, right? And actually, these elements become sort of reasons of distinction or exclusion, right? That somehow contribute sort of this notion of nation building. And Rebecca, you already sort of talked a little bit about this, right? But this idea of this commonality or this community, right? What has this process of eating, right, meant for this Iberian Peninsula? Or reading the different approaches that your contributors have taken, what have you learned about this topic through this project?
If I may jump in, that's a great
Yes,
question,
please.
Rosi. This tension between the present and the past is definitely preserved in this moving sort of array of approaches between historical and heritage ones. One thing that shocked me personally when I was reading all the contributions was how effectively food is reifying Spain's identity as a unified state nowadays. Even in chapters by Jessica Ball on halal tourism, and the chapter co-written by Silvina Shamach-Hesser and Susie Cruz on on the history and touristification of kosher food in Spain, we see how even such powerful manifestations of difference, historically speaking, such ritualized practices of eating differently are now seen as economic opportunities that tourism is exploiting to make the ideal of this Catholic but yet modern and economically viable Spain possible. This is a really shocking thing that I personally am still processing. Or let's take the chapter by Lara Anderson. I'll wear her hat for a second. She reveals how much the food communication during democracy after Franco, even right now, has been affected by nostalgia for a unified Spain of Francoist type, to the points of restaurants offering besides like huevos rotos fusilados or bacalao uno grande libre. Or let's take Bob Davidson's piece that shows how cava, which we so much associate with Catalonia, has in fact become a very malleable carrier of Catalan identity, contested by so many non-Catalan productions of cava because it is a cultural marker that has been chosen by Catalans, but that does not have a very specific terroir, which really is a question. And given how much debate there is about plurality in general, in politics, in cultural debates, food seems to have been spared of all criticism in this way. So there is work to be done there. And this brings me back Lefebvre's idea of a daily practice that should be potentially locus for resistance, but whether or not it is a good question.
Thank you, Eugenia. Rebecca.
Yeah, I will just jump in to add just a brief summary of some of the work that we kind of signal that needs to be done in this area. You know, we talk about bell hooks warning about eating the other, right? Scholars of race and migration are especially attentive to the language of acculturation and hybridity, especially because those often refer on, you know, depend on culinary metaphors. In the introduction, we talk about understanding hybridity as anthropophagy. I don't know if I say that right in English, an idea that comes from Gerwin de Wolf, and this kind of obsession with specific minorities or post-colonial structures. Catherine Mitchell, who's written about diasporic communities, talks about the hype of hybridity, right? And it makes abstract the practices of everyday life, and it also obscures how diasporic and hybrid subjects are used for economic gain. So our contributors are really doing important work as an important first entry into what is a rich area of research that is radically understudied. And, you know, we don't have a chapter from Yeon-Soo Kim in this volume, but I just want to point to her tremendously important work on topics related to this, and a really fantastic article that came out in the Journal of Spanish Cultural Studies about racialized Spaniards, about, you know, Asian Spaniards and using food as a space of resistance. I think that that is, you know, a direction of where this research is going to go in conversation with the ideas that our contributors have already started to circulate in this volume about gastrocracia, about gastrocracy.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I do think that in your introduction, you do highlight some sort of these key questions and tendencies, right? That in food studies and some of areas that we could continue some of these inquiries, right? I think that what Eugenia talked about, sort of that presentism and sort of the developing, is quite shocking because you don't think about these things, right? Consumption is so immediate, right? We're dictated by hunger. So when you are laid out and it is like this, and somebody's explaining to you why you do this or why you find certain items in your supermarket or how you engage with food or what is available to you is actually quite surprising. I found myself retaking or rereading some of what your contributors have written to actually trying to process it because it was a very surprising, very unexpected actually. So thank you for highlighting those. I want to actually leave quite a bit of space for questions and discussions for this session because we do have a very robust attendance today, and I'm sure that you all have many questions and comments. So while I give you some preparation, some time to prepare your questions, again, as Pedro said, you can use the chat box to start typing your questions, or when we finish, you can open your mics to jump in. So while you formulate or think about those questions, let me end our part of this event by inviting Rebecca and Eugenia to go back to some of the words that we started this conversation with. There's lots of words and concepts we throw around when we talk about food studies. And also you've mentioned some more actually in your answers. We have words like gastronarrative, gastronationalism, gastrofascism, gastronativism, gastrotourism, gastrocosmopolitanism, and actually more, you know, there are more of them out there. What do you think these terms convey? In what kind of ways do these terms push or encourage our food-oriented research, you think?
I'll jump in, and this is gonna seem very simple. I think it shows us a way to take food research and critical food studies seriously, by linking food to fascism, by linking food to nativism. In that specific term, it is making a connection for us that we can then go on, to explore further. I think too often the study of food is the fun project, that's on the side, or that it's dominated by anecdotes, which are very entertaining, right? That aren't accompanied by a serious bibliography that we scholars rely on. The proliferation of a critical vocabulary to think critically about food that we see in all these terms, which, it may make us roll our eyes just a little bit, right? But it is a signal that we need to take it seriously. And it's not just in these scholarly circles. I'm thinking about before the pandemic, there was significant media attention about gastrodiplomacy that was circulating, in media in the US. So this is not just scholarly or student audiences. This is like a lay public who is becoming sensitized to, thinking about food in serious and critical ways, and thinking about how it conditions our relationships with the state, with our community, with our friends and family. So I'll pass it to you, Eugenia, to talk a little further about this. What would you add?
All right. Well, thanks, Rebecca. Very, very little more that I can say. There is this thought that on the part of those who do have power, that adding gastro to something makes it, so to speak, more palatable. So, for example, if we take an example of Gastromarca España, it seems such a nice thing, and everybody starts thinking about the great olive oil and things like that. So, instead, if we use the term gastrocratic marca España, maybe we can get more critical attention towards this thing. So there is a tendency of adding gastro to everything, and it becomes really ambivalent, and it is really easier to maybe call things by their names rather than just adding gastro to them. Because, for example, in the case of gastrofascism, right, the monograph about gastrofascism, and I honestly, I forget the name of the author. It is a great book about
Simone Chinotto.
Yes,
Simone
yes.
Chinotto just came out with, yes.
Right. So it is just an incredible book. I'll put later the reference, or Rosi, maybe you can, to it. It's a book about very specific agricultural and food politics that was racialized and was used by the tool of Mussolini's government and Ethiopia. So there is this real fascism in Italy, and then there is a gastro politics related to it that needs to be studied. And this is a completely different way of using the term gastrofascism than what appears in other contexts when we speak about somebody too rigid in their approaches to food, and instead of saying that you're like, sorry, I'm not saying these words, but I'm just quoting them, like, you're a food Nazi. So this is you're a gastrofascism. So I think some caution might be recommended in just adding gastro to everything, and some more specificity would be really useful. And this is why I think that the idea of gastrocratic nature of some of the events and representations that have to do with foods might be more helpful than just adding gastro to everything.
Thank you, Eugenia. And I think there is this notion of almost branding, right? I really take your point when you say that adding gastro makes it more attractive or more sellable in that sense. So the proliferation of this term applied from sort of the market side, or even sort of make it more palatable, it is definitely an issue that needs to be unpacked more critically, especially for those of us who are starting to think a little bit more about these issues. I'd like to invite now our listeners for questions. I haven't seen any question in the chat box, but please unmute yourselves and jump in whenever you want. I'm gonna give a quick 30 seconds to see if we have some takers. So we have a comment. Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, Aitana. We have a comment in the comment section from Antonia Delgado. It says, thank you, Eugenia, Rebecca, Rosi, for this fascinating talk. She's giving a test, but they're looking forward to this communication. And she says that she'll be teaching a course on food and storytelling next semester, and feels like she can use all the help she can get. I think that actually Antonia mentioned something very important when we teach about food, which is narrative, storytelling. As you said, Rebecca, is very fruitful and productive when we engage students with their own experiences. We all eat. We all should eat, right? And we have to eat. Some people eat 3 times a day, some people eat more, some people can't eat more. So these are all ways in which food is experienced in very subjective manners. So inviting students into that conversation, I think, is really important. I don't know if there are any more questions. But another element, perhaps, thinking about resistance is that, and we haven't talked, I haven't asked a question about it, is that these food practices now intersect with questions of climate change, sustainability, and sort of the material reality of our food practices have to come with terms with those realities. And what happens in this sort of idea of common interest when food, the way it's distributed, the way it's thought, the way it is funded, also comes from this very top-down sort of way of understanding food accessible, safe, and affordable for of communities and societies. I don't know if you are also experiencing or reading more about sort of this intersection, but I would also welcome some of your words, Rebecca or Eugenia, about this issue.
Yes, I can begin. So first of all, we do not have a chapter about sustainability, unfortunately. Again, our volume is an invitation for a conversation that hopes to generate further research. I did write elsewhere about some food and, potential for looking at the food system from a more holistic perspective. And in the same volume, it is introduction. It was a short part about food that had my chapter and chapter by Glenn Close in the collected volume about environmental cultural studies, and it was edited by Iñaki Pradanos Garcia. There's also a short work by Jorge Maria, I don't know if Jordi is there, about how film does not do its best to encourage more critical thinking about food. And I think this sentiment has prevailed over my perceptions as I was reading the sections collected in this volume. There is, when we speak about food, especially with the prefix of gastro, we think about this metaphysics of presence, instead of some other approaches to understand reality, in which famine and lack of food and the questionability of availability of food are never a part of the conversation. So we did not address this explicitly. Again, I hope to cover, there's an WECO, that's a lack that I have to acknowledge, and we hope to cover it again. We are working on the Spanish edition of this book, maybe there, or just hopefully in future books and articles and chapters and many more volumes by other people. This is just the invitation. But one of the things that, among all the things that you mentioned, Rosi, the climate change, the dangers to destruction of the potential for food supply, or dangers for food sovereignty of many peoples and nations, is also the new thing that is happening right now, which is the weight of hedge funds, for example, that are drawing up the prices of olive oil cross-nationally, and again, Spain is a huge part of that, and this needs to be uncovered more, and that needs to be a part of the academic investigation about the debates and the practices related to food. Thank you.
Thank you, Eugenia. Rebecca, some parting words before we close the section.
Absolutely. And thinking about the huecos, right? It's no surprise that I'm always thinking about food labor, right? And the intersections between food and care work in Spain is another aspect that is absolutely part of this conversation. And I just want to thank our contributors. It's been an honor to work with you, to learn from you. And so I appreciate all of you being part of this group effort. And thank you, Rosi, for having us here. And also to those of you at Instituto Cervantes, Manchester, Leeds. It's always a delight to converse with all of you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. I know everybody's starting their teaching schedules and running to the next class and meeting students. So thank you so much for making time for us, for a conversation, and we hope to see you in our next Ex Libris in December. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Rosi, Eugenia, Rebecca. Wonderful talk. We have learned so much, and the debate could stay for a very long time, because there are many topics, as you mentioned at the end, that still been going on, and with challenges also for the whole society. So thank you. It's a very important event for us. And let me remind you that the next Ex Libris will be on the 3rd of December. We will have the launch of the book, Bilingual Legacies, Father Figures in Self-Writing from Barcelona, by Ana Casas Aguilar. So I hope to see you there. And also to inform you that this session has been recorded, and we will have that in our YouTube channel. Muchísimas gracias y buenas tardes.
Thank you.